Hello, VC. Welcome to another edition of Pete's CD and Vinyl World. Um, Wanted to do a video today, kind of just a fun video about rock and roll what ifs, meaning just what would have happened if bands had different circumstances. Say a band member didn't pass away, or a band member left or didn't leave, or just some other circumstances. So I just wanted to see how everyone's doing also. We're still here under lockdown in New Jersey. Well, we'll see what happens in the next few weeks, I guess. Anyway, so let's get started. And first band was just going to go over is Kiss. I know I have a lot of videos talking about Kiss, but this one sort of applies here. And I wanted to do what if Peter Criss didn't leave the band. So, actually, during this time, Dynasty Unmasked, Peter Criss was sort of not very involved, let's say. He played and sang on one song on Dynasty, did the tour, and was pretty much out of the band by then. He was on the cover of this, he was in the video for Shandy, but he did not play on it, and by the time they did the tour, they got Eric Carr on drums. So, I've thought about it. What would have happened if he hadn't left the band? And really what I would think would have happened was, after Unmasked, I don't think they would have done The Elder, because at that time Kiss was a four-way. They had four-way votes, and then the manager had the fifth vote as a tiebreaker. So they probably wouldn't have ended up doing The Elder. They probably would have done more basic rock album, which they were demoing at the time they decided to do The Elder. So that probably would have happened. I doubt that would have changed their popularity. You know, they were on the downturn no matter what. Peter leaving the band had no sort of effect on that whatsoever. In fact, most fans in the U.S. probably didn't realize that he had even left the band, really. But at the same time, I don't think they would have recorded as heavy an album as Creatures of the Night. And if they had taken the makeup off and gone to Lick It Up, at that point, it still would have not been as heavy and put them probably in a worse position, because they probably would have still had that glam look in the 80s, and their music would have been much lighter. You know, their first couple albums, non-makeup, were fairly heavy, so even though they were all glammed up, they still sort of were popular with the metal community. So I think that would have totally changed if Peter was in the band. Their sound wouldn't have been as heavy, and I don't think they would have actually been able to maintain their popularity through the 80s. So I actually think it would have probably been a bad thing if he hadn't left the band. Also, they couldn't have used that reunion card later on in the 90s. So next I'm obviously going to do the Beatles. So what if John Lennon hadn't been killed in 1980? So this is my opinion. I don't think they would have done, say, a full-fledged reunion tour, because number one, that wasn't really a thing back in the 90s. They might have done a reunion show or two here and there. That's my take on it. It doesn't seem like it seemed like when the Beatles stopped touring in 1966, it was actually George who really, really wanted to stop touring, and I think John was pretty much in agreement with that. During the 70s, Paul did a couple Wings tours. George Harrison actually did a short tour in 1975, I believe. John Lennon just had a couple of concert appearances. He had that famous Madison Square Garden concert. But other than that, he did no actual touring. And I don't believe Ringo did either. I think for most of the 70s and early 80s, Ringo was dealing with alcoholism, it seemed like. So maybe by the early 80s, they would have, by that time, been interested in doing a reunion. don't know how Paul felt about it. It's kind of, I always thought it was odd that Paul didn't really do any touring until 1989. So I think him and Ringo by the late 80s definitely were itching to do this. So whether they would have done a reunion show or a reunion concert, I don't know. Maybe they would have worked together and done an album, you know. Free as a Bird was a pretty good song. I know it was a John Lennon demo that they finished, but still, if you ever see that Beatles anthology with George, Paul, and Ringo, they definitely still have that chemistry together. So, let's see what happens, because they did remain friends and in contact, and they played on each other's albums a lot throughout the 70s. So, that's sort of my take on it. Next up, go with Metallica. So, of course, Cliff Burton was killed in a bus accident on the Master of Puppets tour. And only a couple weeks later, they got Jason Newsted, who was with a band called Flotsam and Jetsam, as the new bass player. They finished up their tour. I believe they had a tour of Europe to finish with Master of Puppets. Then they recorded the Garage Days Revisited EP as sort of just like a feeler to see how the band was together in the studio, I think, just sort of as a test to him. And then they recorded Injustice for All. Now, I feel like nothing would have been different on here. I think Cliff would have really enjoyed this album. This was their most, let's say, progressive metal. The songs were really long. They had a lot of musical changes. They even did To Live Is to Die, I believe, which was written by Cliff. It was a instrumental, or at least partly by him. So I don't think much would have been different about this album, except obviously the bass would have been turned up. They, this album is known for having basically no audible bass, which I don't know if it was just a jab at Jason at the time, or they just really liked the scoop mids cranked. But I do think that probably by the time they got to the Black Album, that album probably would not have sounded like that. I don't think that Cliff Burton would have gone in that. I don't want to say the Black Album is commercial, but it is more commercial than earlier Metallica. In fact, I think he probably would have wanted to take Metallica even probably in a heavier direction. So at that point, who knows what would have happened. After Cliff died, the band became just sort of ruled by James and Lars. I don't think Kirk ever had much input as far as, like, say of what direction the band went in, even now, as probably he's one of the three prominent members. But I don't know. That's kind of a good question. What have happened with Metallica? Would he have left the band? I don't know. I've never heard of them ever having major battles. But, then again, the band wasn't around too long before he passed away. So, who knows? Next up is Chicago. So what if Terry Kath hadn't died? So it's been reported that even at the last couple albums they did, that he wasn't really happy with the direction the band was going in. They were less and less progressive, less and less jazz orientated, more pop. They were having a lot of more ballads and hits with Peter Cetera on vocals. I think even one of them, I think it's If You Leave Me Now, which has all acoustic guitars in it. He told Peter Cetera just to play it himself. He didn't even want to be bothered. I don't know if that's true or not, but that's what I think that was in that documentary. So what I think would have happened was, from all accounts, he probably wasn't happy at the time. Probably would have left the band. Either that or sort of fought for the band to go back to their original direction. Whether or not it would have been successful, I don't know, because the band was just on a downturn, it seems, anyway. And by the time they got to the early 80s, they were sort of looking for that big producer to give him some hits. So my prediction is he probably would have left the band. Peter Cetera wanted to leave the band also. He was itching for a solo career. They had to really talk him into doing, I think, the last couple Chicago albums he was on. So would they have gotten back together at some point? Maybe, but I don't think Peter Cetera would have. Peter Cetera didn't even show up to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction. So I think by the end of the 70s, he probably would have left anyway. And Peter Cetera, so I think the band almost would have continued on in the direction they went. Maybe Terry Kath would have came back at some point in the late 80s or early 90s. But like I said, I don't think Peter Cetera would have came back anyway. So who knows? This next one is kind of interesting because it's probably, I don't know if this is even true or not, but what if Michael Schenker had joined the Rolling Stones instead of Ron Wood? I read this. I don't know if Michael Schenker auditioned for the Rolling Stones or they had considered him as a replacement for Mick Taylor. But just think about the wild, guitar solos that would have brought onto the Rolling Stones. Even though a lot of Michael's solos are blues based, they also are sort of neoclassical based and hard rock. I can't see this really working out too well, especially since the next album was Some Girls. And, imagine Michael Schenker playing on Miss You or Beast of Burden or some of those songs, even Shattered, so, man, that would have been an odd combination. So, that's sort of like better off that they didn't have this go through because I can't see Michael Schenker lasting that long in the Stones. So probably what would have happened is they would have gotten Ron Wood anyway, and Michael Schenker by 1979 or 80 probably would have still played on Love Drive from the Scorpions and then left and formed the Michael Schenker group. I don't see Michael Schenker staying with anybody too long in any situation. He doesn't stay with singers or musicians more than a couple albums, even his own bands like the Scorpions or when he joined the Scorpions again for the Love Drive. So that's my opinion. Next up is what if Alice Cooper had not gone solo and he had kept the original Alice Cooper band together? So my opinion on this is I think Welcome to My Nightmare would have been a great album for the original band to play on. It was still mostly hard rock, did have a lot of production and outside sort of piano and orchestra parts, but I still think the original band would have done a great job on this. They would have did a great tour. But by the time they got to Go to Hell, that's where Alice really moved away from that original hard rock, garage rock sound. And I don't think the original band would have either stayed on or they wouldn't have went in that direction. Alice at that point was still a big name artist. He was, a gold selling artist. He still was a big concert draw. And he was he had a ballad hit on every album. Go to Hell had I Never Cry, and the next album, Lace and Whiskey, had You and Me, which were both ballads. And From the Inside actually had a hit with How You Gonna See Me Now. So in 4 albums in a row, including this one, he had a hit with a ballad. So I don't know what direction that would have happened. All the original band albums, Alice co-wrote the songs with Michael Bruce and Glenn Buxton. So it was totally different. All these albums were written by Cooper and Dick Wagner and Bob Ezrin. So it's totally different. I think if they had stayed with the original band, they would have stayed in the hard rock vein. Still would have been a big concert draw, but I don't know if the albums would have been as big as the earlier ones. So in that sense, it's probably a good move for Alice to go solo because obviously he probably made a lot more money that way and got his name out there as Alice Cooper instead of the band. it's really a shame that they never really did a reunion, full-fledged reunion. They've reunited with the surviving members. Glenn Buxton passed away, so he was never in a full-fledged reunion with the rest of the band, unfortunately. Um, but I think by the early '80s, also the band probably would have dissolved, just like most of the other '70s hard rock bands. It's hard to keep a four-piece band together, let alone a five-piece band. So I think it probably helped Alice in the future to be known as a solo artist. If they had just faded out as a band, they probably could have came back at some point as a reunion. But Alice was always there at some point. Even during his down years, where he wasn't touring, he was still producing albums. He only had a 3-year gap, '83 to '86, where he didn't really release anything. So that's my take. Next one for Led Zeppelin. What if John Bonham had not passed away? This is an interesting one because, I don't know how much longer Led Zeppelin would have existed anyway, because if you listen to In Through the Outdoor, the natural progression from that album is sort of, the Robert Plant solo albums of the '80s. So to me, that's the direction they were going in anyway. Yeah, the drums may have been a little heavier, and maybe there were some heavier songs. But if you listen to The Firm or some of the other Jimmy Page stuff he did in the '80s, those aren't really guitar heavy either. So I think the days of the bombastic Led Zeppelin were done. If you look at the set list from their last tour in 1979, 1980, they cut out the big jams. They were doing mostly, they weren't doing a lot of songs from the first few albums. So, that bombastic sound was sort of fading away anyway. Now, after the '80s, maybe they would have broken up and gotten back together at some point. Jimmy Page and Robert Plant did get back together in the '90s. They put out a pretty good album, and they did a pretty good tour with it, and they played some Zeppelin songs. So I do think that at some point, yeah, the band would have gotten back together and toured and gotten back to the old Zeppelin. But directly after him passing away, I don't think they would have been the Led Zeppelin that we knew, at least until maybe the late '80s. I think they would have gone through a period of the '80s where their music was really like the Robert Plant solo albums. That's just my opinion. Next up, what if Paul Di'Anno had not left Iron Maiden? So this is an interesting one because, from all accounts, it was a sort of a mutual split up between Paul Di'Anno and Iron Maiden. I think they were looking for a singer with more range, and Paul Di'Anno was just looking to either stop touring or wasn't happy. Maybe he was drinking a lot, doing a lot of drugs at the time, so he needed a break either way. So this was their first real successful album, I think, worldwide. They did have some success with Killers, but this really brought them into the forefront. And on this album, I can picture Paul Di'Anno singing a lot of songs on here. Invaders, Children of the Damned, Number of the Beast, maybe Gangland. But at the same time, there's no way he would have been able to sing songs like The Prisoner, Run to the Hills, Hallowed Be Thy Name. Those have Bruce Dickinson's, voice and name written all over them. So this album to me is a sort of a transitional album between the old sound and the new, what's to come. And starting with, a little bit on this album and the next album, Peace of Mind, Bruce Dickinson really solidified his spot as a songwriter, too, in Iron Maiden. So, if Paul Di'Anno had stayed in the band here, yeah, this would have been a fairly big album. But if they had continued and not progressed into the really progressive Maiden sound of the, Peace of Mind, Power Slave, Somewhere in Time, they wouldn't become that huge stadium selling band. That's my opinion. They would have stayed at the level of a band sort of in the popularity sort of between, say, Accept and Judas Priest, maybe a gold selling band, that wouldn't have lasted forever, especially in the United States. We would still be talking about, if Paul Dano had stayed in the band, I think we would have been talking about Iron Maiden today like we talk about Accept or Saxon or, early 80s Scorpions maybe, but probably not even as big as the Scorpions got in the 80s. So definitely, I think, Bruce Dickinson brought them to the next level, so it probably was a good move for them. Next up is Hendrix. So what about Hendrix? What if he hadn't passed away? So Guitar World did a really interesting article, I think it was in the late 90s or early 2000s, where they did this fictitious article about a review of all of Jimmy's 70s albums if he had survived through the 70s. And it was all about how he would have done some funk albums, some jazz fusion, how he even would have done an album with Miles Davis. And I think all of that is probably pretty accurate. By the time he did Band of Gypsies, he was really off in a totally different direction than Are You Experienced? It was only a couple of years before that. And even Band of Gypsies, which was even more so sort of out there. So I really think that he would have gone and experimented and done all these different collaborations and probably not been in the mainstream as much as he was in the 60s. So he sort of would have probably been an underground act. I'm trying to think of somebody else that was more prominent in the 60s and then sort of went underground in the 70s. At some point, would he have done a reunion with the original Experience? Maybe. He did the Band of Gypsies because I think he was under pressure with either, I don't know if it was the record label or somebody, to get all black musicians in his band because Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell were white. So I think he was under pressure, although I think he did get Mitch Mitchell back in the band at some point. And, during his recording career, he recorded a lot of material. And a lot of it came out later. This is a double album of Hendrix in the West and War Heroes. Was repackaged. I don't know if this one came out in the UK, but albums like this and Cry of Love and Crash Landing had a lot of those songs that he had recorded. So he had a ton of material he recorded. What he could have done in the 70s, we would have went beyond rock guitar, I think, in my opinion. He would have probably went into more experimental music. Who knows who he would have played with? Miles Davis, yeah, probably. Would he have played, imagine him playing in Parliament or Funkadelic? That would have been pretty awesome. Would he have ever gotten back to his original sound, original roots? Who knows? Artists always say, I'm doing an album, getting back to my original sound. Even Cream had a reunion in the early 2000s. So, who knows? But that's how I feel Hendrix would have went. Next up is Toto. So this one's kind of an interesting story. So Toto were offered to do the song Danger Zone from the Top Gun soundtrack. So, and of course we've all know that was done by the wonderful Kenny Loggins. Not a big fan of Kenny Loggins, but think about it. I can picture Toto doing that song. So by that time, Bobby Kimball had left the band, and Joseph Williams was the singer, I believe. So I definitely hear them doing that song, and but at the time they were still a gold-selling band. They weren't a huge touring act in the United States, at least. They had some adult contemporary hits at that time. But I don't think that song would have brought them back into, you know, a platinum arena selling band. I just think it would have gotten them some more money, yeah, from selling millions of albums on the Top Gun soundtrack. But they didn't write that song. They wouldn't have gotten songwriting royalties. And when you think about it, what hits did Kenny Loggins have after that song? I mean, he might have had some. I don't know. I don't recall that many. I do recall him being around, but so I really don't think it would have changed anything for Toto. I just think they would have had another hit that they're known for. But as far as their actual career, I still think it would have went to the trajectory it went. Joseph Williams probably would have left the band at the time. I think he was having some issues. Steve Lukather still would have went on to become the singer of the band and carried on the 90s as they did. Still a huge international band, but not really. They didn't tour hardly at all in the 90s in the U.S. as far as I remember. And they had a lot of good albums during that period. So, again, if they had made that move, don't think it would have mattered. And another thing about the Top Gun soundtrack, Judas Priest, they wanted the song Reckless from Turbo on that soundtrack, and the band laughed at them. After they saw the movie, they said, this album is going to be this movie's going to be a bomb. We don't have anything to do with it. But sort of the same way, I don't think it would have changed their trajectory either. It would have probably made them some more money because they did write that song. But, you know, some of the other people on that album, like Cheap Trick had a song on there, Mighty Wings, and most people don't even know that they had a song on there. Which that song is equally as terrible as the Doctor album that they put out at the time. So I don't think that would have changed anything for Toto. And last but not least, The Who. So this is probably an interesting opinion I have because Keith Moon was sort of on his way out with The Who. They gave him a chance with Who Are You? Supposedly it was like pulling teeth for him to complete the drums on that album. And if you see that concert live at, I believe, Kilburn or Shepperton Studios. Not Kilburn. It was Shepperton Studios where they did some of the tracks for Kids Are All Right in that movie. He was pretty laboring. He wasn't the intense, maniac drummer that he was. And from what I read in Pete Townshend's book and Kenny Jones' book, they were sort of in his ear anyway about joining The Who. So, in essence, I think maybe he would have done the tour for Who Are You? But that wouldn't have changed their next two albums, which would have been Face Dances and It's Hard. So I actually think the trajectory of The Who would have stayed the exactly the same way. And would he have done, like, say, the reunion tour in 1989? Yeah, maybe. Because by that time, Kenny Jones was not in the band anymore either. So my feeling is he probably would have came back for the 89 reunion tour where they did Tommy and big arena, the big stadium shows. And then maybe he wouldn't have been on all of the tours in the future, but probably would have been a part of in and out of the band somewhat. But I actually don't think it would have changed anything, except he probably would have done the Who Are You tour and probably, either left the band or the Who wanted to get Kenny Jones in the band at that time anyway. So I don't think it would have changed any of their career from 1979 to 1989. So that's it. And, let me know what you think about the band scenarios I've talked about, or maybe bring up some of your bands and ask me what I think of what would have happened with some of those bands. So if you like these videos, please subscribe. And I'll talk to you guys soon. Thanks.